The quiet pain behind Audrey Hepburn's smile. In the amber glow of her bedroom at dawn, when the world was still sleeping and the cameras were finally silent, Audrey Hepburn would sit by her window and wonder if anyone would love her if she stopped being perfect. The world knew her as Holly Golightly, as Princess Anne, as the elegant waif who made simplicity look like sophistication and turned a little black dress into a work of art. But long before Tiffany's and Roman holidays, before the world decided she was the epitome of grace, there lived a frightened child who learned that being good meant surviving, that being beautiful meant being safe, that being perfect was the only way to keep the people you loved from disappearing. They called her a fashion icon, a movie star, the epitome of elegance. But what they never saw were the mornings when she would stand in front of her mirror and count her flaws like rosary beads, convinced that she was too tall, too thin, too awkward to deserve the love that audiences showered upon her. Audrey Kathleen Rustin was born in Brussels in 1929 into a world that was already beginning to crack at the edges. Her mother, Baroness Ella van Heemstra, was Dutch nobility with a spine of steel and expectations to match. Her father, Joseph Anthony Rustin, was a British-Austrian businessman whose charm masked a restlessness that would eventually take him away from his family forever. From the very beginning, Audrey learned that love was conditional, that it could be withdrawn without warning, that even the people who were supposed to stay forever might simply decide one day that they had somewhere else to be. When she was 6 years old, her father walked out of their lives without explanation, without goodbye, without the courtesy of letting his daughter know that his leaving had nothing to do with whether she had been good enough. But children don't understand such distinctions. Children only understand that someone they loved chose to go away, and they spend the rest of their lives trying to be good enough to prevent it from happening again. The war came when she was 10, bringing with it hunger and fear and the kind of suffering that writes itself permanently into a child's bones. In occupied Netherlands, where her mother had taken her to be closer to family, Audrey learned that beauty could be dangerous, that drawing attention to yourself could mean the difference between life and death, that sometimes the safest thing to be was invisible. The house they lived in during the occupation was always cold, always quiet, always filled with the kind of tension that comes from knowing that any moment could bring soldiers to your door. Audrey would lie in bed at night, listening to the sounds of boots on cobblestone streets, wondering if this would be the night they came for their neighbors, for their family, for her. Her mother, once a woman of privilege and position, learned to make meals, out of scraps, to darn stockings until they were more patches than original fabric, to smile reassuringly at her daughter while her own eyes betrayed the terror she felt every waking moment. Audrey watched her mother grow thinner, watched the lines deepen around her eyes, watched her transform from a baroness into a survivor. During the Dutch famine, the winter of 1944, they survived on tulip bulbs and nettle soup, on whatever scraps the resistance could steal or smuggle past German checkpoints. Audrey's body never quite recovered from that hunger. It left her permanently thin, permanently aware of food in ways that would mystify those who knew her only in prosperity. But perhaps the deepest hunger was not for food. It was for safety, for certainty, for the feeling that the world was not always on the verge of collapse. She would watch Allied planes overhead and pray that they were coming to liberate them, but also fear that their bombs might fall on her house, on her mother, on the few precious things they had left. The liberation, when it finally came, felt less like victory and more like waking from a nightmare to find that some of the damage was permanent. Too many neighbors hadn't survived to see freedom. Too many children had lost parents. Too many parents had lost children. Audrey had survived, but the girl who emerged from the war was different from the one who had entered it. More cautious, more aware of how quickly everything could disappear. Ballet became her refuge, her way of creating beauty in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. In the makeshift dance studios of war-torn Netherlands, she learned to turn her natural awkwardness into grace, her anxiety into discipline, her fear into the kind of focused concentration that made imperfection disappear, if only for the length of a dance. When the war ended, she was 16 and hollow in ways that peace couldn't quite fill. The dancing continued, now as a profession rather. Siram, then an escape, but it carried her to London, where she joined chorus lines and small productions, always in the background, always supporting someone else's dreams. The theater world of post-war London was a mixture of glamour and desperation, filled with young people trying to rebuild their lives through art and ambition. Audrey was just one more girl with ballet training and big dreams, competing for spots in shows that paid barely enough to cover rent in shared flats where the heat didn't work and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor's disappointments through the plaster. She was turned down more often than she was hired. Directors would take one look at her unusual face, those extraordinary eyebrows, that wide mouth, those cheekbones that seemed carved from marble, and decide she didn't fit their vision. Too exotic for the girl-next-door roles, too innocent for the sophisticated parts, too unconventional for the leading lady positions. It was modeling that first brought her face to the public, magazine covers that revealed a kind of beauty that wasn't quite like anything anyone had seen before. She was too unconventional for traditional glamour, too refined for the girl-next-door charm that was popular then. Her beauty was architectural, all angles and lines and unexpected proportions that shouldn't have worked together but somehow created something extraordinary. But Audrey saw only the flaws. The eyebrows that were too thick, the teeth that weren't straight enough, the neck that was too long, the frame that was too thin. She would study photographs of herself with the intensity beads of someone looking for evidence of her own unworthiness, finding confirmation of her insecurities in every shadow and line. The photographers loved her because she never assumed she was beautiful, never took for granted that the camera would be kind to her. Each session was approached with the seriousness of someone who understood that beauty was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked without notice. The movie offers came gradually, then all at once. Roman Holiday made her a star overnight, but stardom felt less like a dream come true and more like a spotlight turned on all her imperfections. Suddenly everyone had opinions about her face, her body, her talent, her worthiness to stand next to established stars like Gregory Peck. But Gregory Peck saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself. Between takes, he would talk to her about the loneliness of fame, about the way success could isolate you from the very things you thought it would bring you closer to. He became a father figure, a mentor, someone who saw past the performance to the frightened girl underneath. "You're going to be fine," he told her during the filming of Roman Holiday, when she was shaking with nerves before a particularly difficult scene. "But more than that, you're going to help other people be fine too. That's what real stars do." She carried those words with her for the rest of her career, but she never quite believed them. The success of Roman Holiday led to Sabrina, then Breakfast at Tiffany's, then a string of films that cemented her place in Hollywood history. But each role came with its own set of insecurities. She was convinced that she couldn't really act, that she was fooling everyone, that someday they would realize she was just a frightened girl pretending to be confident. Holly Golightly, the character that would define her forever, was supposed to be played by Marilyn Monroe. When the role came to Audrey instead, she felt like she was wearing someone else's clothes, trying to fill shoes that weren't meant for her feet. Holly's confident sexuality, her bold independence, her carefree attitude toward love and money, none of it came naturally to someone who had learned to equate love with loss. But perhaps that disconnect was what made her performance so touching. Audrey's Holly wasn't the wild party girl of Truman Capote's novella. She was a lonely woman pretending to be free, someone who had learned to build walls around her heart and call them sophistication. In Holly's famous speech about not belonging to anyone, audiences heard the voice of every person who had ever felt like they were performing their own life instead of living it. Breakfast at Tiffany's made her an icon, but icons aren't allowed to be human. Every aspect of her appearance was scrutinized, copied, analyzed. The Givenchy dresses, the oversized sunglasses, the perfect posture. All of it became a uniform she felt obligated to wear whenever she left the house. Hubert de Givenchy became more than just her fashion designer. He became the architect of her public image, the man who understood that Audrey's beauty was enhanced by simplicity rather than complicated by ornamentation. Together they created a look that was both timeless and utterly specific to her, but the collaboration came with a cost. She began to feel like she only existed properly when she was dressed by Givenchy. only looked like herself when someone else had decided how she should appear. The marriages came and went, each one beginning with hope and ending with the familiar feeling of not being quite enough. Mel Ferrer was sophisticated, worldly, someone who seemed to understand both the business and the art of making movies. When they met during the production of Ondine on Broadway, he was already an established actor and director, someone who could offer guidance to a young woman still uncertain about her own talents. But guidance can become control, and control can become a prison disguised as protection. Mel saw her potential, but he also saw her as a project to be managed, a talent to be directed, a wife who should be grateful for his experience and wisdom. He made decisions about her career, about their social life, about where they would live and how they would present themselves to the world. During their marriage, she made some of her most challenging films, War and Peace, The Nun's Story, roles that stretched her beyond the elegant ingenue she had become known for. But even when the critics praised her dramatic range, she couldn't silence the voice in her head that whispered she wasn't really an actress, just a model who had gotten lucky. The end of her marriage to Mel was both a relief and a failure. Relief because she could finally breathe without asking permission. Failure because it confirmed her deepest fear that she was somehow not enough to make love last. Andrea Dotti was supposed to be different, a psychiatrist who saw past the surface to the complex woman underneath. He was younger than her, intellectual where Mel had been practical, European in ways that felt like coming home after years of trying to fit into Hollywood's version of glamour. When they met at a party in Rome, he treated her like a woman first and a movie star second, something that had become increasingly rare in her life. But even he couldn't cure her of the fundamental belief that she was not quite worthy of the love she inspired in others. Their relationship became another performance, another role she played, the devoted wife, the perfect mother, the woman who had everything but somehow felt empty. Andrea loved her, but he also loved the idea really of being married to Audrey Hepburn. The affairs, his, not hers, were almost a relief because they gave her something concrete to blame for the relationship's failure. It was easier to point to his betrayals than to examine her own inability to believe that anyone could love her completely, exactly as she was. When their marriage ended, she once again took the blame onto herself, convinced that if she had been better, more interesting, more worthy, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. Motherhood was supposed to fill the spaces that career success couldn't touch. Sean, then Luca, two boys who gave her life meaning in ways that movie roles never could. But even as a mother, she carried the fear that she would fail them the way she felt she had been failed, that her love wouldn't be enough to protect them from the world's casual cruelties. She was fiercely protective of their privacy, determined that they would have the normal childhood that had been stolen from her by war and then by fame. But normal was a luxury she could never fully give them. Because Audrey Hepburn could never just be someone's mother, she was always Audrey Hepburn who happened to be someone's mother. The later films, My Fair Lady, Wait Until Dark, showcased different aspects of her range, but by then she had grown tired of the camera's demands, weary of the constant pressure to be the Audrey Hepburn that everyone expected. Each role felt like putting on a costume that was somehow both too small and too large, never quite the right fit for who she actually was. Wait Until Dark, where she played a blind woman, terrorized by criminals, was perhaps her most challenging role, requiring her to be vulnerable and strong simultaneously. But the real terror wasn't in the script. It was in her growing realization that she had spent so much of her life performing strength that she had forgotten what her own authentic emotions felt like. The decision to step back from acting wasn't really a decision at all. It was an admission that she had given all she could to a profession that had both blessed and exhausted her. But retirement from movies didn't mean retirement from performance. Now she had to figure out how to be Audrey Hepburn without a script, without a director, without the structure that had defined her adult life. UNICEF gave her a new purpose, a way to channel the empathy that had always been her greatest gift. Working with children in some of the world's most troubled places, she found something she had never found on movie sets: the feeling that her presence made a real difference, that her famous face could open doors for people who had no other advocates. The first time she visited Ethiopia during the famine of 1988, she was unprepared for the physical reality of starvation. The children she met were living skeletons, their eyes too large for their faces, their silence more heartbreaking than any cry. In their faces, she saw herself during the Dutch famine, saw the look of someone who has learned not to expect rescue. But she also saw something else, the same resilience that had carried her through her own childhood trauma, the same quiet strength that had helped her survive war and hunger and abandonment. These children, despite everything they had endured, still smiled when she held them. They still reached out for connection, still believed in the possibility of kindness from strangers. In Somalia, in Sudan, in Bangladesh, she held children who reminded her of herself at their age, vulnerable, frightened, hoping that someone would notice their pain and choose to care. The camera crews that followed her on these missions captured a different kind of performance, one where her tears were real and her smiles weren't practiced. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't worried about how she looked on camera. She was only concerned about whether her presence brought comfort to children who had known too little comfort in their short lives. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same fame she had often experienced as a burden became the tool that allowed her to do the most meaningful work of her life. The photographers who had once made her self-conscious now documented stories that needed to be told. The media attention that had once felt invasive now served a purpose larger than entertainment. But even her humanitarian work became another weight to carry. She felt obligated to be not just an ambassador, but a perfect ambassador, someone whose dedication was never questioned. She traveled when she was exhausted, spoke at events when her voice was failing, smiled for cameras when her heart was breaking. The same perfectionism that had driven her acting career now drove her charity work. She worried that she wasn't doing enough, that her privileged life made her an imposter among genuine suffering, that her desire to help was somehow selfish because it gave her life meaning. When she spoke to world leaders about the children she had met, she carried their faces with her like photographs in her wallet. She would describe individual children because she understood that statistics were easy to ignore, but stories were harder to dismiss. In her final years, when cancer began to quietly steal her strength, she faced the ultimate test of a woman who had spent her life being beautiful. Learning how to be loved when beauty was no longer reliable. The weight loss that had once been envied now spoke of illness. The delicate bone structure that had been her trademark now made her look fragile in ways that frightened those who loved her. She died in 1993, at 63, surrounded by the people who had learned to see past the image to the woman underneath. But even in death, the myth persisted. Obituaries spoke of her elegance, her grace, her timeless beauty. Few mentioned the frightened child who had never stopped looking for a father who wouldn't leave, a love that wouldn't disappear, a peace that would last longer than applause. The quiet pain behind Audrey Hepburn's smile was never really about the specific traumas of war or abandonment or the pressures of fame. It was about the more universal human struggle to believe that you are worthy of love exactly as you are, not as you think you should be. She spent her life trying to be perfect enough to deserve the love that was already hers, never quite understanding that perfection was the very thing that kept her from feeling truly known. The smile that charmed millions was real in its generosity, genuine in its desire to bring joy to others, but it was also a shield that protected a heart that had learned too early to expect disappointment. If you watch her films now, if you look past the iconic moments to the spaces between words, you can see it. The slight tension around her eyes, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was looking, the moments when Holly or Princess Anne or Eliza Doolittle disappeared, and you glimpsed the woman who was still that frightened child, still hoping someone would tell her she was good enough just as she was. That woman deserved to know what her audiences knew instinctively, that her beauty was never about perfection, but about the courage to remain gentle in a world that rewarded hardness, to stay open when experience suggested that walls were safer, to keep believing in love even when love had disappointed her more often than it had sustained her. The quiet pain behind her smile was also, in its way, the source of everything that made her luminous.